Alright, welcome to the Ming! With my guest lecturer, Mika. Alright. Time for the real one. Babe.
What?
Babe, turn off your phone. This cohabitation during quarantine is not working! Close that window. Someone's bumping music.
So?
They can hear it on here. This is a very sensitive mic. Here we go. Alright guys, welcome to lecture 3. This is going to be a 2-part lecture over Chinese empires. Depending how long this takes, I might also dip into the Russians, but we might leave that for another day. So we're going to start with first, in period 4, there were 2 Chinese dynasties or empires. Only one of them is considered a gunpowder empire, the Qing. But we're going to start with, in chronological order, the first one that happened in period 4, which is the Ming. The Ming occurred from 1368 through 1644. Now, the origin. We have been looking at Chinese dynasties since your first day in world history back in 9th grade. But if you remember, the last Chinese dynasty we talked about in period 3 was the Yuan. The Yuan were a Mongolian dynasty. It's when the Mongols conquered China, created their own Chinese dynasty to rule over China called the Yuan. So, 1368, the Yuan fall apart and the Ming take over. So the Ming are an actual Han is an ethnicity, Han Chinese dynasty. And they basically were able to kick out the Mongols and took over. Now, during this rise, it is important that the Ming basically go, hey, it's really embarrassing. They were ruled by a nomadic group. Nomads who they generally consider barbaric, un-Chinese. So now, basically, when the Chinese take back over, they make it a real big point of, a real big major point of their policy to try to wipe away everything Mongolian, everything nomadic from society. So, the big thing about the Ming is the changes they make, because those will blend in. We talk about the Qing in a second. So first, the changes made by the Ming. They focus basically on being as Chinese as possible. There's a few things they do with that. One, they basically, I wouldn't say outlaw, but they greatly discourage anyone using Mongolian names, wearing Mongolian clothes, or following any Mongolian cultural habits. Instead, very much re-emphasizing Chinese cultural beliefs, such as the following of Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and the ruler himself also heavily focusing back on those Chinese values. That leads to actually the ruler doing a few things. One, the Ming emperor spent a lot of money making temples and other shrines to Confucianism, a place where he can perform Confucian rituals and really show his Chinese identity and cultural spirit. Second, the Ming Chinese were by far one of the most centralized empires of period 4. And they did this through, when they took back over, basically all the power was in the hands of the emperor. They did that, one, through a heavy investment in infrastructure. The Ming emperor spent a lot of money building canals, building roads, reinvesting in agriculture, and basically making it a lot easier to trade as well. Also, the Ming emperor did something that is not as unique as you might know. We don't really talk about it much, but they did a little bit more, and that was the use of eunuchs. Eunuchs are men who have had their genitals cut off, and basically the Ming emperor had a whole administration built around the use of eunuchs. The reason being is that you kind of had 2 people who were in government. You had the scholar gentry, which were usually nobility, who had gotten a Chinese education, taken a test, now gotten to power. You had the eunuchs. But what the Ming emperors kind of viewed the eunuchs as is people who were, 1, completely loyal to them, and 2, people who would basically do whatever they said. And here's a reason for that. Eunuchs not able to have children meant that there was no risk for a eunuch to take over, start his own dynasty, have his own children. The eunuchs were completely dependent on the emperor. So the Ming used a lot of eunuchs in government as people who would, 1, want the emperor to have power, because 2, their power was connected to the power of the emperor. So this use of eunuchs in government was a big way the Ming were able to keep a more centralized government. Last but not least, the Ming also really focused on maritime travel. I mean, maritime means travel by the sea. Now, China we know as one of the most powerful empires that's ever existed. Over and over again, they're kind of like the center of attention. Remember, in period 3, we talked about the Song dynasty called itself the Middle Kingdom. This kingdom that was literally the middle of the earth, the center of attention. There was a time where the Ming Empire basically almost became one of those maritime empires that we're going to talk about Europe becomes later. And they built, at that time, was considered one of the largest fleets ever created, led by this admiral named Zhang He. He sailed and basically stopped at hundreds of different places through the Indian Ocean, traveled through up to India, and traveled even as far as East Africa, back to the Indonesian islands, and then back to China. This was an amazing expedition. He brought back hundreds of leaders who gave tribute to the Chinese emperor. He gave tribute back to them. This big show of Chinese power. And basically, this was like a turning point in history, you could say. The Chinese literally could have started what the Europeans going to start a couple hundred years later. But instead, the Chinese did a 180 and basically let that fleet go to rot and said two things, basically. One, we are so powerful, we don't need to be going out to people. People should be coming to us. And that mindset we talk about, where the Chinese believe they're so good they don't need to innovate anymore, is going to come again with the Qing. And two, the Chinese emperor who funded all these expeditions, Yongle, died. So those two things kind of caused the Ming to turn and stay looking within, not really trying to expand outward. Then finally the Ming fall, because we're going to have this transition from the Ming to the Qing. That's really vital. The fall. The Ming, two big reasons why they fell. First, taxation. The Ming started what we've learned about before is called the single whip system. This is when the Chinese, after failing to use paper currency because it had nothing connected to it, it was overprinted, it inflated. Inflated means it becomes worthless. The Chinese used a single whip system, which is when everyone had to pay their taxes in silver. This was okay when there was a lot of silver, but at one point the Ming government went through a lack of silver. And what happened is that people would start hoarding it and keeping it. The prices of silver skyrocketed and the economy fell apart. Second, the failure of the government in two ways. First, there's a series of natural disasters, famine specifically, and an earthquake that basically really hurt the peasantry of Ming China, and the government did very little to support people. Still taxing people, but not really doing anything to actually help people who are affected by these natural disasters. And you might ask, why would the government not help its people during natural disasters? Well, in this case, it was because the government was poorly well run. Crazy, right? Specifically, the ruler of Ming China didn't really care about ruling anymore. The emperor had, we talked about a good connection would be to the Safavids, where the Ming emperor didn't want to rule anymore. He cared more about chilling in his palace, being treated really well, getting to enjoy all the great things about being an emperor, but he did not really care about ruling. This left government to basically between the scholar gentry, those nobility who've been educated, and the eunuchs, and they basically were constantly fighting over what the policy should be, so the government really didn't do much. It was like locked in a stalemate. This led to the people of Ming China rising up and overthrowing the government. And this is going to lead to the rise of a nomadic group called the Manchu, which is going to change China in the middle of period 4. While you all studied your notes, I studied the blade. Mika, don't snip the sword. Alyssa, do you want to add anything? What do you want to talk about? Alyssa, do you want to study the blade? Baby, you start playing Fortnite, we're becoming a streamer house. We're quitting. We're setting up some Twitch streams. Me and you, we're gonna monetize this. All right, back to the second part of our lecture, looking at the Qing Empire. Remember, we're still in China. So the Qing go from 1644 to 1912. That's right from the period 4 all the way into period 6. Starting off with its origin, I mean, you basically saw the origin in the first part of the lecture. Failure of the Ming government to respond to the needs of their people, mostly through an inept or inadequate government, leads to the ability for the rise of the Qing. So here's a couple things that are important to note immediately. And this goes with their rise as well. The Ming were Han Chinese. Here we go. The Qing were an ethnic group called the Manchu. Now, the Manchu were a nomadic group from the area that's north of China called Manchuria. They're not Mongolian, but they are nomadic, very similar to Mongols. The Manchu were a tribal people who were able to unite under one strong leader, who was then able to use the anger of the Chinese peasants as a way to take over China and install themselves into power. Much like the Mongols, though, the Manchu did not create a dynasty named after themselves. Instead, they created what is called today as the Qing. Now, The Qing is one of our gunpowder empires. I want to make this very clear. High alert. The Ming are not considered a gunpowder empire. The Qing are considered a gunpowder empire. Mostly because the Qing used gunpowder in their armies, with both cannons and rifles, and became a major part of their military as they grew and grew and grew. So, how they ruled. So, the Manchu are a nomadic group conquering the Han Chinese. So, this means, as we've seen in a lot of other empires, the Manchu are a minority ruling a majority. So, they had what we would call both an accommodating style, but they were also similatory in different ways. We have to see both examples. So, first, how the Qing were accommodating. Basically, the Qing came in, took over power, and they knew that one, the Chinese bureaucracy was some of the best in the world. They also knew their government was also very powerful. So why change much? The Manchu thus became or accommodated to Chinese culture. They started. The emperor would wear Chinese clothing. The emperor would follow Confucian rituals, and the emperor basically encouraged Chinese cultural values. So overall, still trying to keep on this facade of being Chinese, kind of making it easier for the people to follow him. Though it is important to note that the Manchu emperor, while acting Chinese and following Chinese culture, would also, toward his Manchu followers, act Manchu, wear Manchu clothing, speak the Manchu language, even have art done of him on a horse in a very nomadic style. So he had to please kind of both groups. Second, assimilation. While the Qing tried to have a very normal Chinese governmental style towards the people they ruled, they did a couple unique things to really show that they were in charge, to say, like, you need to listen to us. First, all men in China had to wear the Manchu style of hair. This is interesting because if you look at old cartoons of Chinese people, often very stereotypical, very racist caricatures of Chinese, it is actually the Manchu style. Ironically, not even a Han Chinese style of hair. It is something that was forced upon the Chinese people by the Manchu government. All men had to wear their hair in this style at penalty of death. So this was very serious, but basically a way for the government to say, we can control you. There's this mark of our people on you. Another way that the Qing were assimilatory is through their separation of people. While they acted Chinese, it was very important to the Manchu that Manchu and Han Chinese did not mix. They knew that their power came from keeping their people in a way pure. So the Manchu thus made it illegal for Manchu and Chinese to mix and marry and have children, to keep that separation and boundary. This actually goes into our governmental power idea. While the Chinese could still take the exam system, get into government, a merit-based system, the highest levels of Qing government was reserved for the Manchu. So once again, it's this way that his centralized power just put in the hands of the trusted people the emperor knew he had his back, the Manchu. Highest positions were for them. All the mid to low tier governmental positions were for Han Chinese through the exam system. Now this leads us to the idea of centralization, one we've hit for every gunpowder empire. First, the Qing greatly increased the size of the bureaucracy in response to the increasing size of their empire, which we'll get to in a second. But basically, the Qing put even more tax dollars, even more time and effort into creating this large, well-run bureaucracy, which is connected to their army. The Chinese army used gunpowder weapons and cannons, and basically enlarged China to the area that we know of China as today, specifically conquering the area known as Tibet and conquering a lot of North China. These areas, it's interesting the thought process of the Qing. The Qing did not view this as an invasion or a conquest. The Qing actually viewed this in two ways. One, they were defending themselves. They saw future threats that they wanted to get rid of early on. And two, they saw it as like unifying the Asian people under the Chinese powerful group. Remember, the Chinese are the most well-educated, most civilized, so it only made sense that they should get as many people under Chinese rule as possible. And to rule these areas, the Chinese were very, very accommodating. They wanted it to be as cheap as possible. So whenever the Chinese conquered a new area like Tibet or northern China, they did two things. One, the people who were in charge stayed in charge. They didn't change that. The local nobility, the local rulership kept their power. They just had to assimilate to some of the Chinese beliefs. Specifically, they had to wear Chinese clothing and they had to get a Chinese education to stay in power. But overall, the people in these areas basically lived their lives as normal with a little bit more taxes. So if you lived in Tibet and China and the Qing took over, your life didn't really change much. And that was a way that the Chinese basically were conquering more land, keeping their eyes on it, but trying to keep it like as same as possible, not trying to spend too much money on it. Last but not least is faith. A good way to centralize power is that the Qing emperor, even though he was a Manchu, did very public, like he'd do this in public in front of thousands of people, these Confucian rituals as a way to show that he was following through on the Chinese faith and that he had the support of the people behind him. We're not going to talk about the fall of the Qing yet because that's going to be in 1912 and very much more a period 5 thing. But that is our Chinese empires, the Ming and the Qing. We out.